I was doing a little bit of reading and thinking a bit more about my video from yesterday about tube fetishes. I thought this was interesting because I read something from Joe Satriani, who on his new album Elephants from Mars, something to do with elephants. Every guitar sound you hear was recorded direct, and we used a Sans Amp plugin. That's insane. If you could see this room I'm in, it's filled with great amplifiers, and I didn't use any of them. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. So this is a guy who's grown up with amplifiers and is now coming to the stage where he's blown away by plugins, right? Here's another interesting thing. He said, it's really quite funny. I know behind me here are the Marshalls, the EVH and 5150. I had every intention of using all my vintage amps and new amps and everything on the album, but I recorded DI, and as we went through reamping into real amps and using modern software and stuff like that, all roads led back to the Sans Amp plugin. Then he also said, we all grew up thinking proper amp, proper microphone, which sort of true, sort of not. In a proper room, going to a proper machine of some kind with a proper engineer. So he's talking here about the experience of kind of pro guitarists who've grown up using studios and going through that process. He says, I've made so many albums and been in so many studios and had that horrible feeling that I need to compromise what I want to play because it doesn't sound right. I stand by my amp, it sounds great. I mean, this is the experience that a lot of us have. Then I walk into the control room and I go, oh, that's right, microphones are not ears. Then you spend hours and hours, piles and piles of gear you go through, and it's never what it really sounds like. So after a while, I was thinking, this is stupid. What am I chasing? There's no rule. If it never sounds the way it is, let's just start from a new reality, which is, I want the sound of my finger touching the string on the fretboard to be transmitted to the audience. So that's what's really interesting to me. I've never really heard, I don't think, anyone articulate that quite so clearly. If it never sounds the way it is, let's just start from a new reality. So for me, the experience of miking up some of my tube amps, which sound great in the room, is a lot closer to the feeling that you get when you listen to a modeler. So once you listen to things back in a control room or something like that, you have that feeling, okay, well, that's not as juicy as it sounded when I was in a room with it. So I think it's probably fair to say that most of us would agree that in most cases, you lose some of the magic of the tube amp by the time that it gets back to the desk and in the recording, right? Whether it's through kind of digital conversions, or whether it's through the difference between having two ears in a space versus having two or one microphone somewhere on a cone. There's this kind of thing that happens where some of the magic may be lost. And so maybe that's part of why people like Joe Satriani are now saying, oh, actually, this modeling stuff is a surprise to me. I didn't realize it could be this good or whatever. For those type of guys, it can be refreshing and new. Now, on the other side of things, someone who I'm pretty sure has grown up and certainly was related, closely worked with Misha Mansour, and these guys were kind of there at the forefront of not just Line 6 kind of pod stuff, but also there with the fractal audio stuff, a major proponent of the fractal stuff. Tosin and Misha Mansour, these guys, they've recently recorded an album. They went back to real amps for this. Tosin said, we've used modelers for over a decade and we're using them exclusively at one point. These things have become indiscernible from their real tube counterparts. On this record, we were getting plug-in tones that we were happy with, but we had a loud room with some cool amps. So just for shits and giggles, we reamped some things to see if the quality of the tone was different. And again, there's another point there. They're reamping. So these guys aren't talking about feel. They're not talking about anything other than just tone, which is interesting. Reamped some things to see if the quality of the tone was different. We found that particularly in the low mids and the lower frequencies, there was a different character to a mic on a loud cab. We objectively decided that we were getting more life out of the recorded tones, and we were happy with the behavior in the low end. So we ended up retracking everything, and we would compare each section that we reamped to the printed plugin preset we had, and we were always happier with the recorded reamp version. We were being very objective, and we did A/B them. And then the interviewer asked them, would you say the lack of body in plugins made them inferior to the real amps for the heavier guitar parts? And Javier said, in my opinion, yes and no. I think it has a lot to do with who's running the recording session and who's miking the amps up. When we did The Joy of Motion, we were at this $1 million studio with Friedmans, Marshalls, and everything you could possibly want. But in the control room, it felt no different than the Axe FX because there's 50 feet of cables and the cabs are in the other room and the mic positions are a variable. For this album, we are using a different recording engineer and his techniques for mic and the cab were 100% different. in a much less expensive studio, but the results were substantially better and it felt different than the plugins and modelers. I still don't know which is better in general, but other than doing the entire album with amps, there's definitely a thing to real amps that I think all of the digital companies still haven't been able to replicate. So that's kind of two people coming from, I guess, kind of opposite experiences. Joe Satriani grew up with valve amps, playing valve amps, has had the joy of playing them live for many years and studio experiences, but also articulated that the studio experience can be quite frustrating because it doesn't sound like it sounds in the room, which is something that I guess all of us have had with modelling. We've thought, well, that doesn't sound like how I thought an AC30 might sound, or that doesn't sound like how a Plexi sounds. All these kind of things that you read so much about online and stuff. So I thought that's really interesting to see that articulated from the real amp perspective as well. Once you get into a studio, it doesn't sound like it does. I thought that was interesting. And then on the other hand, you got Tosin, who presumably has been mostly using modelers for quite a while now. Certainly had in recordings from, you know, many years past, he's got his own kind of plugin, the Neural DSP Abasi thing, and he's kind of coming back to this real amp thing and finding that there's loads of great stuff in there as well. And I think Igor is on tour with him at the moment. He's saying that he's using a Morgan live now. In the past he used a Helix with a dual rectifier power amp. So it's interesting to see that even these people that could use whatever they want to, realistically, like Joe Satriani, can afford or could do whatever he likes, and especially in a situation where you're reamping, kind of the take is already there. You just use whatever is sounding best, probably. And in both cases, you've got Joe Satriani who's saying, right, I ended up using the plugin, and then Tosin saying, we ended up using the real amps. It's interesting to hear that that's how two guys coming from slightly different generations think about it. Myself, I've also grown up being able to, or having to use modelling sometimes, or recording with modelling because it's convenient, and also experiencing the joy of a tube amp in the room. I think most of us agree that there's benefits to both, I think. I went to the zoo yesterday and it kind of made me think about the kind of similarity of you might be making a film and you think, right, I want a polar bear in this film. And for some people at some stage it might be the case that you could have CGI polar bear that looked indistinguishable on video from a real polar bear. And I think that's roughly where we are with digital modeling now. If you play an A-B, you know, comparison, I can fool myself regularly. I think it's very easy to get, not very easy, but it's certainly possible to get very close tones that are practically indistinguishable. So say you've got a polar bear, you've got a real one here, and you've got an indistinguishable CGI version. The difference though would be in real life, if you get up close to that kind of set and you've got that real polar bear there, there's a whole different experience there. You know, you could touch its fur or something, you could get attacked by a polar bear. Probably it'd be a bit more difficult to work with, frankly. And then equally on the CGI set of the polar bear, where they're just using something to pretend to be a polar bear until the work gets done, I think maybe that would be a bit of a weird set and maybe the interaction might be a bit different. But in the end, the results could be roughly similar, assuming you didn't get mauled by a polar bear. That's, yeah. But anyway, I don't know. I just thought that was interesting to hear that from kind of two massive guitarists that could use whatever they want, to hear that they've kind of both done slightly different things for slightly similar reasons. Interesting. And I'm going to go check out that Sounds Amp plugin. Cheers. This is what we actually came here for. Any of you guys into jazz?
No.
You got YouTube?
No. They're meant to be following their mum, they're going rogue.
Get off of that.
Ducklings do that sort of thing.
That's an electrical fence. Get off.
Hey, there you are. Electric to me, mate. What, a duck?
Imagine coming to a zoo and spending the whole time.
That's what I am doing. Oh, look, the little guy there is caught on the left. The little guy's caught on the left.
Oh, no, he's not. He's trying to look for extra little treats. They're hungry.
Duck, 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 duck.
I think they should escape. haven't seen any more monkeys though.